Hey,
Hi there.
Ellie.
Hey there. How's it going?
Doing great, doing great.
I'm actually having some issues with my laptop. I'm gonna quickly log off and I'll be right back on.
Hey, hi Jonas.
Hey, Prashant. How are you doing?
Good, good.
Good.
Nice. Oh, okay, since the Dave is in the discussion today. That's
Yeah,
nice.
I finally brought this up.
Excited to know the opinions.
Yeah.
Hey, I love it.
Hi, Lauren.
Hey guys.
Rocco. Hi Dan.
Hey everyone.
So I realize this is a meeting I will never miss because I currently have 5 different calendar events on my calendar for this one meeting. With all the changing of like which calendar things are assigned to and everything. Somehow I've got like 5 copies of it.
I just do. Wow, that's a lot.
Your phone must go kind of wild 10 minutes before the meeting starts.
I mean, well, luckily I only get like 1 notification for all of them, but
Ja.
Ik moet één nachtje slapen en dan gaan we.
Okay, it's 9:05. I think we can gradually get started. Thanks everyone for joining this catalog community sync. Happens every 3 weeks. As usual, this meeting will be recorded and the recording will be uploaded shortly after this meeting. So let's get started on the topic list. So the first topic of today is a Terraform provider for Iceberg REST catalog. Alec, do you want to chime in? And
Yeah, definitely. Here, I'll share my screen. I've kind of got my proposal document up. So I raised this in the dev list sometime last week, but I think the proposal that I have is now that we have kind of a vendor agnostic Rust catalog spec, I'd like to propose building out a Terraform provider. Terraform is kind of the default way of doing infrastructure as code, being able to list out your resources and have Terraform figure out what changes need to be applied to them. So it's used by pretty much everybody. And I think we've seen that certain catalogs, like cloud-specific catalogs, can be managed via Terraform. But I think there's kind of a gap for this kind of vendor-neutral solution where we could have a Terraform provider that hooks up to an arbitrary Iceberg REST catalog and then allows you to manage like your namespaces, your tables, your views, and whatever other resources we end up extending the REST catalog spec to in the future. So I'll kind of, I can keep talking, but I'll kind of pause there and see if anybody has any thoughts.
Sorry, just to interrupt, could you please like zoom in the doc a little bit?
Oh,
like,
yeah, absolutely. How does that look?
Yeah, that's good for me.
Cool. Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, so I have kind of two areas. The first is just like assume the Terraform provider, and I haven't read through the entire doc, would mostly just cover the elements of the spec that are defined in the specs, even though setting up a REST catalog from an infrastructure as code perspective may require a lot of other operations. So if you're, setting up a Glue catalog, obviously you would probably use the AWS Terraform to set up Glue catalog and then populate information, like namespaces, tables, things like that with this portion of the provider. Is that the idea?
Correct, yes. And I don't want to speak too much for them. We've socialized this a bit around the Polaris community as well, and I think they have some interest in some version of this, probably separate, that could be used to stand up your Polaris instance as well. But definitely setting up the catalog. And I mean, I guess that's also kind of a question for the room. Like we have cloud-specific catalog implementations that live within our various Iceberg libraries. So would it be appropriate for like the Glue catalog resource to live in this provider? That's kind of up for the community to decide.
Yeah. And so my second one was more around licensing. So Terraform is Mozilla license, right? And that's a copyleft, which is incompatible with the ASF licensing. So the question is really like, do we have dependencies or other things that would make it difficult for us to achieve the proper licensing guarantees for something that we host and manage as a project?
That is a fantastic question. So I know we wouldn't have to take in the Terraform framework, so to speak. I'm not the Terraform plugin portion of this, since we're kind of each plugin is basically its own RPC server. I'm not entirely sure about the licensing behind that.
And then is this written in Go? Is that?
It is, yes. And my hope was that we could build this on top of Iceberg Go, because then any improvements that we see, we can contribute directly back to Iceberg Go.
Ryan?
I actually wanted to ask a question about a different aspect of this. So if we're still talking about like language and licensing, like we should probably move ahead with that. I'm actually wondering about the suitability of this for data purposes. So my understanding is that Terraform's great for things that can essentially replace themselves. So, if I have instances of a service that I want to bring up or down, like that's really nice. But, what happens if your Terraform, omits a schema or a table or something that was previously there, and reconciliation goes and drops it? Does that, do we need something to be able to undelete by ID or like those sorts of issues? Because these are very stateful objects, and you can't just remove them and recreate them and have the exact same environment.
I think that there are lots of semantic questions around this, but at the same time, there is a lot of precedent out there for Terraform providers to do exactly this kind of thing. Because like Snowflake has them, Databricks has them. I don't know what the behaviors are, but there's some methodology that's used, and it probably takes into consideration that you don't want to drop things. You just alert on them and say, hey, this is a drift. We can figure out what those specific mechanics are. I think it's probably more important to figure out, like, can we actually take something like this on? Like, is there something that prevents us from doing it, like the licensing?
I think the second half of that question, though, is what APIs do we need in order to make the semantic part happen, right? Because I'm assuming it's not just going to be drop and create. It might be like, hey, does this thing exist by ID? And something like, hey, if I want to roll back to before I drop something, I need to know what that ID was, and I need a undrop table and things like that. So it would probably be a healthy revision of the API to include those things. I'm just kind of wondering what they are and what this really looks like.
Yeah. Hopping right back to your point about Terraform in its reconciliation process, deleting things. From my experience as a Terraform user, Terraform will create resources pretty much at will. It will give you 5 different warnings and force user intervention in order to delete resources.
Oh, okay.
Especially for kind of data sensitive resources.
Right.
Yeah.
I just want to chime in the same thing. The people are deploying to their production databases like Postgres or MySQL, then manage with the Terraform. Terraform is fully stateful, and also you can do the things running the dry run. And this Terraform usually enables the SREs to initial setup for the system. Let's say that you have a regions, like you just create your Terraform, and SRE can replicate the exact deployment to another region for your use case. I am just assuming that I use Terraform for data lake purposes, and we had the US Central. We want to just replicate the exact same system with the EU. Then there is a Terraform. They just change region information on the Terraform as a variable. Then the rest of the things are deployed by the Terraform and managed by the Terraform. And this also gives like Git-like commit history. Then they can see that what happens on the historical, the changes. It is very useful for SRE-related type works.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
For licensing side, for Daniel, the Terraform is under the HashiCorp license, and OpenTofu is the open license version of that. They are currently 100% is compatible. OpenTofu under the Linux Foundation. Whatever we provide, that it can be interchangeably usable from the providers.
Yeah, and I'm just looking through some GitHub repo searches. It looks like there is a Terraform provider that lives in Apache, the Apache Foundation right now for Cloud Stack. So it's there's at least some. I can dig into the licensing stuff because I don't fully know, but there's at least some precedent within the Apache Software Foundation.
There's also a comment from Laurent saying modules can be licensed under AS2, or Apache license too. So that'd be great. We just need to make sure that we don't accidentally pull in any copyleft licenses, because that's a big problem for the foundation.
Cool. Sounds perfect. Go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question. So if let's say like we're going to like check the scene, like one like well would be the best place for this would be like a separate repo like under the Iceberg kind of like scope, or it be checked into the main Iceberg Java repo as a separate module?
I think we have to do a separate repo because unfortunately, so the package managers for Terraform, the Terraform registry and the OpenTofu registry both expect a separate repository.
See, so it has to be like a separate repo, for example, like named Iceberg Terraform.
Yeah, I think I've been calling it Terraform Provider Iceberg, whatever we decide to call it.
Got it.
Ryan, I'd love to go back to your point about the additional spec changes. What I guess, do you have any thoughts on kind of how we can establish what changes to the spec might be necessary? I definitely agree that I think like an undelete regardless would be super useful.
So that's, I would love to explore like what we want there. And part of the reason for that is currently the spec does not really use table UIDs as first-class identifiers. So tables have UIDs. The table metadata or table and view metadata that gets sent back to the client has a UID, so the client can verify, hey, this UID has not changed. But it is not something that we use or expect to be indexed in at least the protocol. So there's nothing that is like, hey, load table by UID or something like that. That I think is probably the biggest conceptual difference between what you would probably need, but I'm speculating. You would probably need something to like identify some resource and be able to load it that way. So we might just need different load table routes or something to make the reconciliation process easier. Dan, you would probably know more.
Well, so I mean, you can use like its namespace and name as the identifier and use that to load. And I would expect that's how we would build it, because I don't love the idea of extending the complexity for REST implementations in order to satisfy a Terraform provider. So I'd rather lean into, from a Terraform's perspective, like the namespace and table is the resource identifier. I think that's perfectly reasonable. I'm not sure what other providers in this space use, so it may be worth looking at, what Glue, Databricks, Polaris, Snowflake are all doing for resource identifiers. Make sure that we're doing something reasonable for the definition of all of these resources. I think the same thing applies for something like undelete. Like that's a very heavy lift for basic implementations to support in order to use Terraform. And then I don't know from Terraform's perspective, like if features like that are optional and we can work around it. So like if you wanted to add it, but some people didn't want to implement it, like what does that mean for the provider and what it can actually do? So I'd lean into just using what's available today. And if there are gaps, if that's satisfying some other need, maybe that makes sense. But if we're doing it purely for the Terraform provider, it's kind of questionable. I think most of what people want to do, you can do through the APIs. Like Alex, in your exploration of it, Was there anything that you felt was missing that is like typical of a Terraform provider, or?
Not particularly. I mean, in the end, kind of every Terraform resource basically just has 4 methods: create, read, update, delete. I tried to kind of map them out the best that I could, and I think it sounds like the read portion of this is where we're performing a get operation is going to be the most challenging, based on kind of the lack of an API. I'd originally thought that there were get APIs that we could use. We could also potentially, I think there's like a list table operation that we can use and then filter on that.
But I mean, so you can call it get, but the resource identifier has to be the namespace and table. You need both of those in order to do the actual get.
Right. Which seems very that seems very reasonable to me.
Do a lot of these use like bulk operations? So if you know about some specific tables by ID, I guess there's a question of like, would the Terraform provider consider 2 tables with the same name but different underlying UIDs the same table?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Then yeah, we wouldn't. I was going to say, like, would we need to expose those things to like a namespace listing if you're using a different identity? But if you're using the identifiers as your identity, then yeah, it would be fine to use listing.
Yeah, Terraform is expecting some kind of identifier or primary key. That's very much baked in.
Okay.
And I think the use cases typically are going to be setting up like a new environment, a shell environment. Like we wouldn't expect that there's data, so we don't probably need commit or any other APIs. The table create is probably still necessary just because people like to define their schemas and everything like that, and then run it through Terraform to just establish like, hey, here is the empty environment of like what we're setting up. The data create part aside, things like maybe later if there's a reason to do that, but that's a lot more complicated.
Yeah, in my personal experience, I've only seen these things kind of used at control plane layer and not at a data plane layer.
I don't think we need to cover the data creation.
Yeah.
At least for initial version of that.
Dennis?
Yeah, and I think that I also agree with that. But I think probably scoping with basically identifying what things already make a lot of sense, without additional primitives to build on top of, and which things would make sense to add, but not necessarily just for Terraform. Because I think it's interesting that some of these things that were brought up with like UUIDs, especially so table UUID in bulk listing, is something that has come up in other discussions because not just for Terraform, but it seems like nowadays there are more processes going on more features that different products and different services are building that involve some notion of syncing between Iceberg catalogs. So it is something that would be generally useful. Like we've often discovered that having UUIDs come up in a listing so that you don't have to do like a point load table on every single one after listing 10,000 tables would be really useful for either reconciliation of like renames or reconciling state in general, and other kinds of semi control, like other things that are more metadata oriented, such as possibly properties or like maintenance types of settings on tables would potentially also fall in that category. So there might be a category of things where we could say, even though Terraform made us think about this a little bit more, if they're not necessarily Terraform specific, like they would be useful for other kinds of reconciliation processes as well, they are, I would say, worth pursuing separately anyways. But either way, probably not needing to be a blocker for having like the basic Terraform functionality.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%.
Thanks for this proposal, Alex. So just check, is there anything else you would like to share? On this?
No, I think, yeah, if nobody else has any points of discussion.
Yeah, I think we can continue the discussion. Oh, yeah,
Sorry,
please go ahead.
John. I have one question. Now, if everybody is agree for this proposal, how should we proceed to create a repo on the Iceberg, under the Iceberg?
I think we just need a PMC member to create a repo. We would, I guess, is there enough interest that there are multiple that will contribute here? Because that I would want to make sure, that we have someone to review the initial contributions, help out with licensing, and help sort of form a sub community around this, and then we just go to ASF Infra and request a repository.
Yeah, there's also the additional, like, do we need accounts in any of the like Terraform or other places where it's hosted so that these actually get published? Or is this something you expect people to pull down the repo and apply somehow in their own environment themselves?
Ideally, we'd have accounts at both the Terraform registry and the OpenTofu registry.
I think that would be probably a matter for the first release from this repository. So yeah, as long as we have like a set of people saying, hey, I'll do this, because I think what we don't want is to have a repository with exploratory code that never really goes anywhere. So if people are committed to doing this, let's create a repo.
So I think maybe bringing it back to the dev list, seeing if we have general interest. I mean, I know that people use Terraform. I don't know if there are people like, even, I don't know if Christian is here. Like if there's been any other call from other, people who have catalog implementations to have a Terraform provider. This is the first time I've heard of it in context of the Iceberg REST catalog. So
there is general interest. We sent the email to mail list also too. I can share the thread.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked at the thread yet. So if there are a bunch of people saying, yeah, I'd contribute to that, then let's just do it.
I'm also happy to help with like the infra and all the stuff around it. If you need any help.
Thanks, Falco.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Cool. I think now we have a path forward. So for the time sake, let's move to the second topic on our list today. So the second is the read restrictions, modeling bound terms and expression representation. Prashant, you indicated that PR. Do you want to?
Yeah, sure. Sure. So this is mostly in a way to represent, I would say, resolved expression, which have like the field ID also. When we serialize this expression, and obviously we deserialize it back, so sending it to the catalog, from the catalog to the clients, so that we can have cases like column renames addressed. I wanted to bring up some discussion points and would really appreciate your reviews in this. Let me bring the one major discussion point is, if you'll see in the unbound representation, we have something called named reference here. Now, there are two options. So like what we are saying, that there will be another reference which has both the ID and the name. And we already have a named reference which just has name. So essentially, there are two ways to go around it. One approach is that I introduce another base class called unbound reference, and then named reference and resolved reference both extend the unbound reference. But this API also needs to be updated. So either we can mark this as deprecated and then operate on unbound reference, so that anything that depends on named reference continues operating, and at the same time we can change all the other classes which references named reference directly to unbound reference. The another suggestion Thank you so much for Amog and Stephen to take a look into this PR. Another recommendation from Stephen is that we make named reference as the base class and resolved reference extends the named reference class for getting this representation. So this way, there is not much of a churn that we bring up in terms of like Rev API breaking changes and everything. So just wanted to bring and get like, wider opinion, and if like what do you all think, and go from there. Okay, Ryan?
Okay, thanks. I guess, is there a case where we, I guess, don't have or don't want a name? So I think the goal here is to, be able to send a reference that is bound to a field ID, or sorry, not bound, but is tied to a field ID rather than a name. So in case I have column X and X changes, the name of X changes, the reference is not invalidated.
Yes.
So to me, this seems like it's not a case where we don't have a name, because a user is never going to specify, take column ID 3, right? So we created this thing from a name, and therefore it seems to me like a named reference that is more specific, right? It's a named reference that we found to be tied to some specific ID. So I would probably opt to send all of the information that we have, which is both the name and the ID, and then let the recipient make decisions about how to handle that, which would basically be, if this column was renamed, or I can detect it's renamed because the name doesn't match, that's okay, because I care more about the ID. On the other hand, if I wanted to do something like, check if a rename has occurred, I have the information to do that as well. So I would say, like, probably go for the second option of creating a subclass of named reference that doesn't require breaking the API and just makes a more specific named reference. I also would say, like, we're totally fine once you bind something, getting a different name.
Makes sense. Makes sense. This way the signature remains intact on the named reference part of it. So existing works. Cool. I'll go ahead and implement that. That makes sense. Cool. Okay, Laurent, you had a question?
Yeah, sorry. I'm trying to wrap my head around like exactly what problem we are solving. I tried to read, but like I didn't, I guess, dig enough. But like, is it the case basically when we have like hypothetically a catalog and we want to set policies through as Iceberg expressions, and at that time we are setting the policies by using names, and then later on when we are basically we're doing load tables and we are getting the read restrictions, we want to make sure basically if there was like a schema change, the identifier is correct. Is that like the problem we are trying to solve?
Yes. So you attached a masking policy at, let's say, snapshot 1. Now the table, you renamed that column, and now a reader wants to read that table at a later snapshot where the column has already been renamed. But since the masking policy was attached to a column at snapshot 1, it was named different, and now it is different in the recent snapshot. So since we want the client to do the binding at their end, because they are aware of what snapshot they are going to read, we are giving them the enough information to do and find the right columns to operate on. Okay. So yeah, that's the motivation. Yeah.
Is it really an Iceberg problem versus being a catalog problem? Couldn't the catalog implementation basically, when it's getting the policy attached to the snapshot ones, make the right thing and use the field IDs, and then when like later on, like you are like returning the policy, is actually using the current schema and matching the IDs to return the right names? Isn't that like an alternative as well?
I don't think that works with time travel specifically. So if we read as of a snapshot, it will use the schema as it was defined at that particular snapshot. And if your policy is based on a name that has evolved from there, then you have a mismatch between what was the actual column and what the named column is that's being projected.
But as I understand also, like time travel, when you are getting like the whole metadata, and time travel is done by the client.
It is done by the client.
But the policy you are returning is basically, I guess, based on the catalog doesn't know for which snapshot you are trying to get the policy. So even like then the client should be basically doing the reverse. It's like, hey, like I'm getting the policy for the latest schema, and I need basically to get the IDs, and then try to see if I can still apply basically to my previous schema. But like I'm not sure like always like having the IDs and stuff. I mean, helps a bit, but like it's also like creating, I think weird conflicts. I don't know.
Well, I think like as with so many things with the field IDs, it just resolves any ambiguity about which column is being identified, right? So even if I have the current policy from the table, I know if I'm reading some other schema, which column specifically that policy is calling out, because we're doing it by identifier, not by name.
There's a case where you could also drop a field. So if you have a masked field, like, you know, social security number or government ID number, you could drop that from the table. Time travel would allow you to reconstruct the table, so you don't want to actually remove that policy from the table. Doing this by name would create the inability to even, you know, send that policy back to the client, because you don't know, you know, essentially which schema to match it against to do the unbinding and rebinding. So I think it's generally a better practice to refer to columns, you know, by their field identifier for cases like this. And that way policy, you know, we also don't want to create cases where you are, you know, rewriting policy for older versions or things like that. Like we want one specific version of policy that we know is to be universally applied, because of the, you know, no one thinks of this in terms of like branch level policy or something like that. So I think it is good to have this as you know, field ID based.
Yeah, the delete, column deletion is actually like a very compelling reason for having it.
Precisely. So yeah, that's the entire motivation of it. Since we are already at it, I wanted to bring one small niche use case, and I think it's since we are talking about schema evolution, the other type of schema evolution is type promotion. And the thing is, whenever we attach a masking policy to a column, we define. So for example, in Databricks, every masking policy is a UDF. It has a predefined type of the column that we want to operate on, and then a return type as well. So the type of the column is already defined as part of the masking policy. So even that's true for Snowflake as well. So what we do is that if you are attaching a masking policy to a column, you can't promote its type or you can't change its type. I mean, we have our type promotion rules, but we don't change its type. But we don't need to define anything in the spec. Catalog can simply reject type promotions, saying that, hey, because you have a masking policy attached to me, I'll not let you update the schema. And we keep on working on the assumption of IRC in the how we return this, but catalog can block it insufficiently. So that's the thing I wanted to
do we have, the way I think about this, we are probably going to have specified transforms for column masking, right? Like always null, you know, last 4 digits, first 4 digits, you know, some sort of those sorts of things, right? I think you have a list of them, in fact, from Ranger.
Yes, Ranger, yeah.
Okay, so like we know what most of those are, and I think that we should try to define for our type promotions things that are consistent, right? So like last 4 digits of a int and of a long are exactly the same, right? So we could easily like produce those types of things. I think that in general we should do that, and then if you do have a UDF, you would need to check on the catalog side, either reject, which is perfectly fine for policy, or just check on the catalog side. You know, does this secure UDF have a version for int as well as long? You know, if there's a version of the UDF that applies to the promoted type, then I think you're good to go. That would be a choice in the catalog layer, though.
Yeah, I don't think we need to overspecify the space. I think most catalog implementations that have restrictions or recognize that there is type promotion or something would just reject the request. And, you know, then the number of cases where somebody is using the combination of ABAC policy plus like type promotion is probably relatively narrow. And if we can just block it, you know, implementations can choose. I think the only question then is like, you know, if you're trying to support multiple engines through that interface and you have a less restrictive catalog implementation, that may be problematic for the different engines that want to talk to it. But, you know, that I think most people will probably just lean into blocking type promotion for these cases.
Makes sense.
Like what happens with time travel, since we mentioned time travel earlier, because like, let's say you don't have a policy, you have like, you are doing time promotion like at some point, and then you are adding the policies. Like, does it mean like it doesn't work? Like that's the behavior we are looking for?
So anytime you can't apply the policies, you have to fail the read. This is for trusted engines. So let's say you promote from int to long, and there is a UDF for the long version, and then someone like drops the int version of that UDF. You can no longer time travel to the older versions, because when you try to find that UDF that you have to run in order to show this person data, it doesn't exist. So if you cannot bind the UDF that produces a value, you must fail. Similarly, like if you have a row filter that says, you know what, only allow this person to see test data, you know, where test equals true. If the is test column is no longer there, you can't show the user any data. So like we do need to make sure that the spec covers failure cases and that you fail closed. In fact, we should probably just have a thing that says blanket fail closed. But yeah, I think that is how we would handle most of those situations in which some state has changed that invalidates the policy.
Precisely. I mean, in the spec also we have written, if you're getting any expression or transform that you as a client does not understand, you have to fail close and stop the execution at that point of time as a recommendation in the spec. Yeah.
And in addition, like a catalog that is implementing this kind of policy should also do validations to make sure you're not altering the table in such ways that you would break policy. But again, like fail closed is the safest recommendation from the spec perspective. But like you can prevent dropping that column if it's referenced by a policy. You can, you know, block type promotion if it's referenced by a policy. So all of those things are possible to allow the catalog to prevent getting into a bad state. But if you're in a bad state, fail close.
Precisely. Cool. That was pretty much what I had. Thank you so much for giving your feedbacks and input. I'll address them and probably raise a PR against the Iceberg main repo as well.
Can you ping me on Slack and I'll go take a look at it too? Thank you.
Oh, sure. I'll share it in the Slack as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Prashant. Yeah, so let's move to the next one, which is the idempotency key format. So this is one like initiated by Huaxin, and I saw like Lauren is also involved in that discussion. Lauren and Huaxin, do you want to give us more context for this discussion?
So basically for this idempotency key, currently in the proposal and also in the PR, I have that this key needs to be a UUID, and it's preferred to be V7 UUID. My question is that should we mandate the UUID version in the spec, or should we leave the version to the implementation and not mention it in the spec. So currently, the two positions in the discussion of the PR. So one position that we should require the UUID to be V7. The reason is that the V7 UUID encoded the timestamp. So basically, it's time shortfall. So it's so it's easy for the server to handle this. Another position that we don't want to mention the specific version in the spec because it's more like implementation thing. And also, not all the library supports this UUID v7 yet. For example, GDK doesn't have the v7 UUID support. So I want to ask the community which position we should take. Dennis.
I think Laurent is first, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, thanks. Since I'm the one, like I guess, pushing strongly on UID 7, I guess I'm putting myself in the shoes of the catalog implementation, where like if that's like just like advised but not mandatory, like the catalog cannot really take advantage of the shape of the UID and do like optimizations. And considering like a UID implementation, like a UDV7 implementation is like 10 lines of code. So not having it in, I guess, like as part of default platforms, like it's coming in Java, but Java, like a next version of Java, not an existing one. But I thought it was not like a big burden on the clients. So that's my position. I'm just trying to say like if that's not mandatory, basically like most catalog implementations say, hey, like I cannot make any inference, and so I don't care really about like then the UID in general. Dennis?
So while I agree that having smarter semantics is nice to have, I would almost think of it as expressing it as a first-class feature or a decision. I think for one thing, I wouldn't want the UUID itself to be assumed to be self-descriptive in any kind of way, right? Like if we only have a string field, and then we start having code that bakes in assumptions about the v7 format, even if it's spec'd now, it makes it harder to change. And it seems like initially it's almost like making a statement saying like maybe we intentionally don't want to enforce certain kinds of semantics initially, and I guess what I'm getting at is I would say if we want specific formats, maybe we should consider having a two-part kind of idempotency key, like having something that's specifying the version, the spec version of the idempotency key itself, or maybe a type kind of enumeration that potentially allows a server to treat it differently. But it should be first class. Like I wouldn't want anything that bakes in any assumptions about the format, because maybe we want to switch, someday to a new format with, once new discoveries have been made, where maybe it's like a colon separated something or other, right? That contains other kinds of metadata about the intended idempotency semantics. So I either keep it, like if we have a simple case, then maybe we should make it very explicitly simple and make it that, servers should not make any inference as to the semantics of the key of the UUID there.
So my comment is, I don't think we should overcomplicate this. Saying that we want a UUID is somewhat prescriptive. So if we're being prescriptive, we should make it useful and just say, make it UUID v7 required. I don't think that prevents us in the future from being able to accept other kind of keys, but like, I think either we make it opaque and put some minor restriction on it and let catalogs just like deal with whatever a client produces, or we make it valuable. And v7 seems like the most valuable, just because then you can quickly exclude obviously wrong or out of range UUID generation. the timestamp piece is not perfect because of clock skew and like all the other reasons, but it is actually generally helpful for just kind of initial vetting of requests. So like I would be in favor of just saying V7 for now. Let's not overcomplicate it. And if we do find that there's a more complicated things, we can find new ways to introduce that, either with a different parameter or some sort of catalog client configuration in the future. Ryan?
I think Dennis makes a strong argument about behaviors of this protocol, like being first-class citizens, supported by first-class citizens in the protocol. So if we wanted to, have a time filter on this, it does make sense to me that we would probably have a timestamp embedded in this key. At the same time, like I think there's the protocol, and the protocol probably should not be dictating like a compound key. That seems like overkill. And a UID 7, like let's face it, if you specify a UID, you're going to get a UID v4. Like, so you either get no information, or we specify UID 7 and you get some time information. I'm more interested in this for debugging than for like rejecting clearly bad versions, clearly bad timestamps. Because if you do get, I'm skeptical that if you do get a UID for like a long-running transaction commit, are you really going to decide like, well, this is the first time I saw this UID, but it's more than 10 minutes old, so I'm going to reject it. I don't think that is probably something that we would do or want to do. So like for debugging purposes, I support UID v7. And for clarity, I would say, let's just use UID v7, or else you're really not going to have any information. But I do think that like if we are going to say, here are rules that you should apply to incoming IDs, we should make the information a first class part of that ID.
But the obvious kind of like meaningful response that we can give to a client that is enabled by V7, that is beyond just like debugging purposes, is that if I see a request come in and it's outside of my window, like I retain for 5 minutes, I see it come in at 10 minutes delayed, I can reject it from, reject the request and say, it looks like you have issued a request that's well outside of the retention window, as opposed to treating it as a new request that I no longer know about and I try to apply because I don't have any timestamp information. So I do think it's actually valuable from the catalog's ability to vet and return responses when things are kind of clearly outside of the windows of what it would expect.
But there's nothing that says the client didn't create a UUID for this commit, rewrite a whole bunch of metadata, and then send that UUID to the service.
But that's bad client behavior, right? If your operation between when you make the item potency key and when you make the request is so long that it's beyond the amount of time that the catalog allows.
But if it is bad client behavior, then that supports Dennis's assertion that it should be first class in the protocol, because then we're saying you should be able to reject things based on the age of when the token was generated. And in order to do that, like, why are we recovering information from a UID? I think recovering information from a UID is good for debugging purposes, but if you actually want to say, you need to generate this thing and give me a timestamp or nonce from right before you sent the request so that I can do something with it, we should just make that a requirement of the protocol.
I feel like that's like kind of implied, if not explicit, by using UUID v7 and saying we're using it because of the timestamp behavior of that UUID. And that's why we're requiring v7, not just a random UID.
But I think where we're at though is that we are not, we're not saying that it has to be generated at that time, right? Like why place additional restrictions on how and when you generate the UUID for this? And why use a UUID to send that information rather than a more complex key?
Mostly because we don't need a more complex key, right?
Stephen, sorry, you've been waiting a while.
Yeah, I think I agree with Daniel say, hey, if we think require UUID with 7, we need to have a type field to say what is group idempotent key, what the type of this idempotent key, to be clear about it. Yeah. So we cannot just we cannot just say in spec say require UUID, but there's no other way to actually define that implementation to assume it. Yeah.
I agree with you there. Like I like the being specific so that you don't get UID v4s and UID v7s mixed together from different clients. But I think if we are going to have behaviors in the exchange based on this, like I would tend to agree with Dennis's point that we should just separate that out as a field.
But what does that end up being though? Like we're creating a timestamp that still needs to be generated at the same time as the UID, or something else that we would use to indicate to the catalog that this is when I generated the request, so that we can get those behaviors.
But for example, we currently generate a UID for like Spark generates a UID for each of its commits and passes that in the commit info somewhere. We also take that, I believe, or at least we used to take that and embed that into file names to sort of tie together file names that are part of the same commit, so that if anything goes wrong, you can sort of identify those things.
But we don't use those values.
Right, but I'm saying there are cases where you may want to, stash this UUID somewhere outside of the, so, separating out the time component that you're going to make decisions on and the UID component arguably makes sense to make this more general. Plus, you don't then have to parse, parsing information out of a UUID doesn't strike me as a good idea unless you're debugging something.
Yeah, and to that point, in fact, to Ryan's point, I have seen that, like in general, moving idempotency key generation earlier in your end-to-end stack is useful, right? And so I can also see that possibly being a use case, and maybe that hints at, like, if we're more prescriptive about the use case, like we could, like, I also agree with Daniel that, like, we could decide to be much more prescriptive, saying, like, yes, definitely be someone, and there are these behaviors. I think if we were to do that, it would be very important, it seems, to also have very strict interpretation of what the server must do. It can't be like the server can now try to reject things that it parses out as the timestamp being older than X minutes, because now this is exactly one of those tricky cases where like what we've seen is what I've seen is, if people are using one catalog provider and then moving to another, and then they have something that happens to be working for a while. So, like, suppose they had like a timeout interval, a timeout set on some intermediate proxy to like 2 minutes or something like. Right? They have a particular timeout set through like some complicated infrastructure stack, and it just so happens that one catalog that one server that implements it such that they reject UUIDs past n minutes has correct semantics. So they never really corrupt their data on their old catalog provider, because that old catalog provider happens to interpret the timestamp a certain way, and now they move to another that interprets it differently, like from the expiration time, whatever. Like that slight difference is something that we would want to avoid, right? Like those are subtle things that people will forget, that their infrastructure is interacting with catalogs in a very specific way. And if it's hidden, if these timestamps are hidden in the UUID, it just makes it less obvious compared to if there was an explicit field that made it very clear what the client was trying to declare and what the server is required to do with that timestamp field.
I think all of that same confusion can potentially exist regardless of how you define it in the protocol, unless you just explicitly say, and I think we should say, that the UUID should be generated at time of request. And why is that? Well, you shouldn't be using data from earlier in your process of building a commit or performing an operation, because you may have to retry, in which case you've made a request. Now I can't reuse that information for my retry request. I have to generate something new. So I don't want to use something like the UUID that was used to create the files, or the UUID that corresponds with the the task or the commit or something like that, because I may have to make multiple requests in relation to that. And now I am both creating new ones and using old ones. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Mostly, we could hide this whole item potency key at a very low level within the REST implementation. And you explicitly say, like, this UUID must be generated at the time of the request. It'll be used for item potency key, and it's discarded after that point. So I feel like, yes, we can make this really complicated. We could add a whole protocol around item potency, but it seems like we're over-engineering at this point. Lauren?
Yeah, I kind of like agree with what you just said. Like, I just want to point out that like the problem of like multiple server implementation having different behaviors is like, even without item potency key, there's like so many things going on. Or like you could have, for example, like servers which don't have the same expiration capacity. Like some may say, oh, it will expire after 5 minutes, and that's because there's a cost to keep the keys, like, and it's not necessarily cheap, right? And you did that perf, like when you're doing everything at scale. So like there's always been difference, but I think like we are over emphasizing. I mean, like Daniel say, like, hey, like really, like it's about like for a single request over a long list of requests to actually change a table or access a table or whatever. Like the item potency key is for a single request. Like the spec says the key has to be globally unique, like for each request. So you cannot, not supposed to reuse the key. And so like for me, like trying to say, oh, like we need to match things with like potentially like other UIDs, we having things doesn't really make sense. Like what I like about like the UID 7 is that it's very simple. Because it's V7, we know it's a timestamp component, and like catalog can choose to use it or not use it. But like it's very simple and not prescriptive. Like some catalog may use for debugs and audits. Some may say, hey, actually I can leverage that. Like it doesn't put a huge burden on the client. And like I thought it was just simple enough that like we didn't have like to have like very complex conversation about that. So
I agree with that. I think stepping back, if there's value in UID 7, and the spec is simpler for just specifying use UID 7, just specify use UID 7, and servers get their own implementations, right? Like services can decide how to use that information or not to use that information, but it is like, it should probably be there because we see value in it for at least debugging purposes. So I would say like, yeah, we should just make it UID 7.
Yeah, and if we do that, maybe we should then say clients should not assume that, like, you shouldn't make assumptions about the behaviors related to the timestamp semantics of it, unless we want to go down the road of actually complicating it.
This wouldn't be clients. I think Laurent is right about the requirement is you generate this UID for the request, you use it on retries of that request, but otherwise, like, don't reuse it for anything.
Yeah, and not rely on the fact that a server might auto reject. Like if you're letting it carry you through like accidentally using old timestamps, then that can't, right? Like I think it's important to say like you can't rely on.
This should be considered like an HTTP level protocol thing. This isn't an Iceberg level protocol thing, right? So you shouldn't be incorporating Iceberg business logic or other things with this. It's HTTP request level.
Agreed. Like this is you generate, when you create this request, you generate your UID, stick it in the header, send it off. Like that, I think is sufficient. There's no like client level requirements we need to place on it, other than this is the format, and you know, for simplicity, it's UID 7.
So thanks for the all the valuable discussion. I just want to quickly wrap up because we are over time. Thanks everyone for joining this meeting. The recording will be out shortly. Let's see.
Hey, Hannah,
Okay, bye-bye.
we had a number of items that we didn't get to. Can you just make sure to move those?
Yeah, so those will be carried over to the next one.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.